All right, let's make a formal introduction for our listeners. Good afternoon, Stephen. My name is Claudio. I'm calling you from Washington, D.C., from the Student Fairfax. We're very humble and grateful that Stephen Taylor accepted our invitation and show. Stephen, this is part 2. Welcome again, man. How you doing?
Hello, Claudio. Stephen W Tayler here, as ever.
That's right. How are you, man? You doing all right? How's the
Doing
weather
fine. Well, funnily enough, the weather today, looking out the window, it's pouring rain. So it's nice to be inside, even though I know the WOMAD festival is on at the moment, which I haven't been to this year, but I can imagine that's not very pleasant being outside.
Oh, yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. Man, you are a little introduction. You're an English mixing and recording engineer, music producer, musician, composer, who has contributed toward hundreds of albums, including Kate Bush, of course, Suzanne Vega, Peter Gabriel, Duncan Sheik, Howard John, Stevie Nicks, Rupert, Hine, Tina Turner, The Fix, Howard Jones, blah, blah, blah. Man, you're a very famous guy, so I'm very grateful that you're spending an hour of your time with me, man.
I mean, it's quite a diverse set of artists I've worked with over the years, which is why most of my career, I haven't really been sort of pigeonholed into one category. I mean, there are certain areas I do specialize in, but it's been interesting and, such a really fascinating bunch of people.
Yeah. And they keep it fresh,
Yes. I mean, there are some artists that I'm delighted to be invited back to work on more projects, but it does keep it fresh when you're always changing to work with different genres and different styles of songwriting or music writing. And so I've been very blessed in that respect to be involved in all kinds of different capacities as well, from basic recording through mixing, through co-production and production, and in more recent years, composition and some involvement with live events. Not much, but that has also been fascinating.
All right, good for you, man. Let's go back to the period of you starting your career between 76 and 80. 3 bring name that I want to bring into attention: Gong, Bill Bruford, of course. Any recollection, any memories from that period in your life?
Well, working with Gong was not incidental, but it turned out to be one of the first. It was in fact the first during the first month of me as a mixing engineer, and I was working with a producer called Dennis Mackay, who had been a staff engineer at Trident. And he went on to become a producer, and he got involved in all kinds of acts like Mahavishnu and Shakti and Gong and Tommy Bolin. Tommy Bolin was the first one, but Gong was very shortly after that. And I only came in at the mixing stage. So during that, I seem to remember only meeting Pierre Merlin during the mix sessions, because literally it was just Dennis coming in with the tapes and Pierre. And I'm not sure I even met Alan Holdsworth at that stage, because he had played on the album. Brilliant.
Correct, yeah.
But that was a real experience for me, because, yes, I'm working alongside Dennis Mackay, who was one of the finest engineers, well, still is, but at that period, he was quite sort of creative and innovative. And so I picked up a lot from working with him, and he had picked up a lot working alongside Ken Scott before that. So there was this sort of lineage of interesting production techniques, etc. So I don't remember much about the Gong album, other than it really suited my sort of musical tastes at that time. So I felt very lucky to work on that. Soon after that, I started to get more involved with the actual recording and mixing of projects. One of the first where I did the whole thing from start to finish would have been with Brand X. But very shortly after that, having got to know Brand X's keyboard player, Robin Lumley, Robin was asked to produce Bill Bruford's solo album, Feels Good to Me. And Robin asked me to come alongside him and record and mix it. So here was my introduction to Bill Bruford. Now, I'd been a big Yes fan during the Yes album period and Fragile, so I was a big fan of Bruford. So that was really a great opportunity, and to meet the other great musicians, but particularly Alan Holdsworth, who now this was a second hookup, but this time I get to record him and meet him. So that was a fascinating project. I mean, back in those days, recording an album such as that was done relatively quickly, I have to say. You know, we'd had 2 or 3 weeks of recording and then about 10 days of mixing at the most. You know, so bands would come in fairly well prepared. What I do remember about Bruford was that so much of the music was not only sort of written and rehearsed, but it had been handwritten. Bill would write all those complex, particularly like the marimba or xylophone parts, or vibraphone or marimba, as well as all the keyboard parts for Dave Stewart. So it was very well prepared, but it allowed for myself and Robin Lumley to start thinking of sort of interesting approaches to the recording techniques. And so we started to develop a lot of things that then sort of led us through the next few years.
Yeah, that's great. And Stephen, you mentioned something interesting. Is it for someone like myself that, you know, don't do that for a living? It's a big difference between, obviously, I assume that the pay is better if you do the recording and the mixing. But at the beginning, you were doing just the mixing. Is it so? The recording is already done for any band, right? XYZ band. The recording is already done. Okay, now Steven, sit here. I want you to mix the stuff. It's a lot harder. I mean, the product is kind of already done, right? 90% done. Is it? Let's say the recording is great. I suppose that the mixing, easy for me to say, wouldn't be that difficult. But if the recording is not that great, how can you kind of improve it, fix it, add your Stephen Taylor touch if the stuff is kind of 90% cooked, so to speak, right?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I mean, things have really changed. In those early days when I started, really a lot of choices and techniques had to be committed at the time of recording. It wasn't like now where you have multiple chances to redo something and do hundreds of alternative takes and things. You had to not only get the sound quality as you hoped to capture it, which would give you maximum amount of control for the mixing process. But it's about committing the performance. And that was really, you know, capturing the sound was really important, but it's managing in a very sort of limited time period to get the performance onto tape, because back then, once it was on tape, there was very little you could do in the mixing other than change the level, change the compression or the equalization, or add the reverberation or the delays, but you weren't able to actually go in and sort of do editing the way we can now to fix things or make them louder or quieter. So you really hoped that the quality of the recording was good, but also the quality of the performance. And I was quite lucky because I was getting projects in that had been recorded by people who really knew what they were doing. But then as I started to do it myself, you know, I began to learn the importance of, yes, getting you don't want to commit a sound that you can't undo, like it by adding too much distortion or too much effect. But at the same time, if you're happy with what you're hearing, then you should capture it. What's happened in more recent years is being able to record something and say, well, we can decide how to deal with that later. And that's become known as a bit like a thing called fix it in the mix, which it makes it interesting these days when I am sent a new project to mix. Quite often there's a lot of choice and a lot of tracks, and the drums might have been recorded with every microphone on a separate channel. Back then, you didn't have enough tracks to do that, so you had to be very good, like recording Bill Bruford or Phil Collins back then. We were recording on 24 tracks, so you had to make choices about how many of those 24 tracks you could assign for the drums. Before that, it was 16 tracks, so generally there would be 4 tracks of drums: the bass drum, the snare drum, and then a stereo pair of tracks with all the other tom-toms, cymbals, hi-hats, and everything mixed together. So you had to be very committed about how you assembled that. But that did mean that if it was done right, it made the mixing a lot simpler. These days, you've got to kind of go through the whole process of reassembling from scratch. And particularly now, I'm remixing a lot of projects that were recorded during those early days. It's a reminder of how good some of that, that real sort of making decisions there and then. It was important, and from time to time it really worked, and from time to time it was a real problem and difficult to fix.
And you say I'm going back to working the old stuff. Are all those master tapes stored somewhere safely and over the years for different bands that you can take you go back to the tapes, or improve generation after that? So
well, it's an interesting question because I have been mixing a lot of albums that are up to and even more than 50 years old. Sometimes tapes are lost forever. Sometimes they have deteriorated to a very poor state, and they can mostly be restored and then what we call digitized. So they're copied from the technique they have to do with a lot of old tapes is they have to bake them because they've become like they've started to disassemble and become the oxide has become sticky and it falls off the backing. So what they have to do is they have to bake it so that it hardens, and then they've got one chance, one run through to play it back and record it digitally. And that is there's huge business these days of people doing that, because so many back catalogues are, just stored away in warehouses, or, as I say, in some cases lost, and you can't go back and remix. But a lot of the older tapes I've received to remix from, some have been transferred and they're absolutely perfect, and occasionally you can hear there are issues, and then you have to try. At least these days we have a lot more good restoration possibilities with software and various techniques, but it as I say, it's interesting seeing how good the quality of the original recording was, how good the performance was and the capture of it, and then how well it can be restored after all this time.
Very, very good. The year after, in 78 and 79, you worked with Peter Gabriel in his second album, Scratch. I think you did the mix there for label Charisma, and then you did another track a year after for the track called I Don't Remember. feel free to elaborate of memory you have with Peter and Rod Fripp in the same room and arguing and trying to make it better. One can say, do it this way. The other guy, no, whatever you can tell without being sued by the.
Well, it was a very interesting thing, really, because they had recorded in various places outside the country, and they came into Trident Studios to mix it. And I wasn't the engineer that was brought into the project, was one of the other staff engineers. And I think what had happened, the mixing wasn't going very well because there was a certain sort of friction between Peter and Robert Fripp. On an artistic level, they agreed in a lot of ways, and it was a very interesting concept, the way it was produced. But what they had this fairly inexperienced engineer who was kind of caught in the middle between them, and he wasn't coping with it well. I mean, he was inexperienced, but also from a personality point of view, I think he wasn't managing to kind of get things done. I was brought in as one of the other staff engineers, and really it was almost like to become a sort of diplomat in the middle of this situation. So I had to work alongside this other engineer, but sort of take over from him and try and resolve the sort of differences that Peter and Robert were having. It's hard to remember because, as usual, I probably just, set my head down.
Concentrate on the job, right?
Yeah, and just got on with it. And as always, trying to sort of make sure everybody was getting what they received. So it was mostly that Robert really wanted to keep it fairly minimal in terms of effects or treatments. It was to keep it fairly dry and unaffected, apart from Peter's voice, which had a very deliberate effect on it using a device called an Eventide harmonizer, which can change the pitch slightly. And it was to kind of give his voice a sort of double layer of sound by having it slightly out of tune with itself. And so that was the one sort of real effect, along with and I wasn't part of the recording, but along with like Robert's tape loop type effects, his layering and all the rest. So, but it was really interesting. I didn't mix every track. I did about 80% of the mixes on that. But I ended up with two of my all-time favorite tracks that I've worked on, one being White Shadow, which I think is the most amazing track, and also I can't remember the title of the other, but one of the more sort of acoustic based songs. Beautiful. So it was a bit of a challenge, but that was my introduction to Peter. And because I was becoming more involved with Hit and Run, which was the company that looked after Genesis, and consequently they set up another division for Peter after he left Genesis. So Peter had gone on the road to do promotion for the Scratch album. But while they were passing through London, he wanted to record potentially what they thought might be a next single. But anyway, it was a track. The band were in town for a couple of days, and they came into Trident to record it. And I was brought in to engineer this, and consequently was given a sort of co-production credit on it, because it was kind of Peter really producing it himself, but with the sort of technical side handled by me. So I recorded that, and then they went off on tour in America shortly after that, and the track wasn't finished, but it just so happened I was visiting America for the very first time in my life around the same time. And so I managed to hook up with them in New York to record Robert Fripp doing a guitar overdub solo for I Don't Remember, the track it was. And so that was done. And then a few days later, they were in Chicago, and I happened to be in Chicago at the same time as well. So they did a show, but on a day off, they came into a local studio there to record Peter's vocal and for me to mix the track. And so that was kind of wild, because this is some of the first work I was doing outside of Trident, in a sense. So I mixed this track in a completely unknown studio, and that led to another part of my life, because they wound up wanting to hire me, and I actually moved to America to work for Paragon. But that's another chapter, because that led to a lot of trouble. But anyway, but that track worked out really well, but it wound up being the B-side for Games Without Frontiers. So, it's a great track, but it was kind of a transition period for Peter's production. It was sort of part way between how he'd been with Fripp and partly on the way to the slightly more eccentric sound that he ended up developing with Steve Lillywhite after on the next album. So that was my introduction to Peter, really, and it was short-lived. But I did end up being managed by Hit and Run Management. So there's been a sort of real connection with the whole sort of Genesis, Brand X, Peter Gabriel thing throughout my whole life as a result of that sort of Trident period where I was involved with Hit and Run as well. So, yeah.
Got it. Perfect. Oh, now we're talking about Genesis. In 76, obviously, you worked for with the production of the Genesis, A Trick of the Tail. At the time, of course, Peter Gabriel had left. They're looking for a singer. They were trying different singer. Phil Collins, who got a great voice at the time, he tried to raise his hand, me, pick me. But then they were trying different things. And feel free to then again elaborate what you remember. That was Trident. They were bringing different people, right?
Yeah, it's very hard to remember anything about that, because it's such a long time ago. I was an assistant engineer and not the exclusive engineer for that album. They used to rotate us, so and that was quite a long production from memory. So I was only involved in a handful of the recording sessions, and I seem to remember being there for one of the sessions where they invited singers in to come and do a trial vocal on, I'm trying to remember which song now. No, I can't remember, but I don't remember anybody specific. There were a lot of unknown singers. There was one relatively well-known session singer, again, whose name I can't remember, but he had sung a lot of the backing vocals on Status Quo's records, and he became very famous as a session backing singer. And he was actually quite good, but I think there was still this thing where everybody realized that Phil Collins, having already sung solo tracks and backing vocals with Peter, that he already had the sort of best fitting sounding voice to go with what they were doing, and the real understanding. So I can sort of understand why they went that direction in the end, rather than bringing in someone new. But but it certainly was, an interesting time. That really was my only involvement with Genesis. But there is one small anecdote I have that I don't remember much about, other than the fact that I remember I was asked by Mike Rutherford and Tony if I could help them record a church organ for a film soundtrack they were writing. And so I remember being hired to go outside with a portable tape recorder and some microphones to a church somewhere in North London at the crack of dawn with Tony and Mike to record Tony playing an organ solo for this film soundtrack. Now, this film is called The Shout. It's not very well known, but it's quite a weird, eccentric film. And the other weird piece of trivia about that was that those two wrote the music soundtrack, but there was also some electronic sound recorded and featured in the film, because it was actually about a weird avant-garde electronic composer. But the electronic side of it, and also there's a moment where the main character does this enormous shout. I mean, it's a weird film. You have to go and look for
Check it out. Yeah.
But there is a big shout in the middle of the film. It's a real psychological thriller. But all this electronics and effects and stuff was composed by Rupert Hine, who I hadn't even met at that stage. But so there's this weird connection through this odd film through Genesis and Rupert. And of course, I think I met Rupert shortly after that at Trident. But so that really was my only involvement with Genesis around that time.
Yeah. Wow, man. Can't believe all the people that I was looking through the list again of all the people who worked.
Obviously, I did a bit more work with Phil Collins.
That's what we're not talking now, right? So, in 81 to 89, a couple albums with Phil Collins. You did a track, I think, "Don't Let Her Steal Your Heart Away." I think you did the mix, and then a VHS live at Perkins Place in 82, both in 82. What?
Well, that
was like to.
The thing is, I've known Phil previously. I first met him on a film soundtrack that David Henschel was working on. That's the first time I met him. I worked with Brand X with Phil. Phil came in and did guest drumming on a Rod Argent album that was produced by Robin Lumley. So I got to know him quite well through all those connections. But he was in the early 80s. He was currently having a success with the single, but he had recorded this and filmed this live show in I think in San Francisco, is it Perkins Palace? They'd recorded the sound for the King Biscuit Flower Hour, which used to be a broadcast thing that happened back in the 80s. So they wanted me to mix the live show, which I did. And it wound up then being synchronized to the footage they had of that and released on VHS. So that was great. I got to, and Phil came into the studio to do this while he was in the English top 20 with, I guess, Can't Hurry Love, I think was his hit at that moment.
Yeah, wow.
In the studio, and it was great to be mixing, some of his big songs, so that was fun. But when we finished mixing that live, his next single was you just mentioned it. I did a 12-inch mix for I've forgotten the title. What was it?
The track was "Don't Let Her Steal Your Heart Away."
Oh, that's right. Yes. So
the VHS was live at Perkins Palace.
Yes. Yeah. So that was like 2 or 3 intense days. In fact, might have been just only like 2 days in the studio doing all that work. And that was the last time I saw Phil. And I know he was going through a lot of publicity at that time because he was having hits, but he was also having personal problems and things like that. But
yeah, correct.
I remember it being a lovely time to hang out with him and catch up. But I haven't seen him since 40 years.
Yeah. I think he's in kind of not in very good shape, according to Mike Rutherford. I saw an interview with Mike that they were asking how's the health of Phil, and he's not that great. And
right,
it's too bad because, like I told you before, when we began talking, for me, Genesis with Peter Gabriel's called Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin are, according to Claudio, the best band in the history of music in the last 50 years. But that's my take on this stuff, So it's going to eventually, all of us will die and pass away, and it's going to be a sad. He's a very good person, I don't care about his personal problem or divorce or I always remember the good things about people and the music in my case,
Exactly. So. I mean, I'm working with a lot of material these days of people who have passed on or the rest. And for me, it's preserving the great work and the memory,
of course.
And keeping them alive in that sense has become very important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we talked before, it's kind of Mr. Fripp, Robert Fripp, he's kind of complicated person anyway to say that, but he's a great musician. Nobody will deny that, right? So
exactly,
it kind of sometimes go with territory, Great musicians are sometimes difficult to get along with, or so forth, right? So, but that's
well, sometimes the friction between people, this is something I think we might have talked about before, but when you get the friction between people like Peter and Robert Fripp, or amongst the members of the band UK, or even in Rupert things, there would be times when there would be friction between the people, and so many times that's kind of what creates a lot of the absolute moments in the music. So yes, a lot of the time music is all about joy and people coming together and all the rest, but sometimes when there is friction in there, it produces an amazing result. It's just that you don't want to really remember too much about that or even talk about that too much, because that's not what you want. You want people to sort of get their own feeling of what music's all about. So
and sometimes something very simple, any band, right? You're sitting in you're sitting here instead of the mixing recording booth, and then two guys to your left, one to the left and to the right. No, I want my drums to be better, goddamn it. No, I want my guitar in track number 2 to sound louder than your drum, because whatever. And you want two people talking, screaming at you in the back, and you say, man.
That's why you have to become a diplomat. That's what it is.
Yeah, you need to be like a psychologist to a diplomat.
Yeah.
It's a difficult job, I suppose. But that brings creativity, right? Everybody agree on a track and everything, and then only one person is doing the job, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So you need input for all the band members. Another great album, 84. Of course, Tina Turner, Private Dancer, Break Every Rule, record and mixing for Capitol Records, 1984. Yes. What can you remember?
Well, that was a very interesting project. Tina had just started to have some recognition and success with, I guess, one of the singles she did with Heaven 17, and suddenly her manager thought, we've got to get an album made, and it was an extraordinary thing. He pulled together different teams of people, and had all these different teams working on a couple of songs each during the same 2 weeks. So because Roger Davis had, he had connections with all kinds of different people, he asked Rupert Hine to produce one song and to write and produce one song for her. And there were various other teams, there was Terry Britton and Mark Knopfler and all these people off in different places. But this meant that everybody was kind of preparing the tracks without Tina there. I mean, I think the songs had sort of been either demoed or approved or whatever, but you had these teams working on their couple of songs each at the same time. And so from what I remember, I hadn't met Tina at this point. I think Rupert might have had a production meeting with her and discussed the material. So he'd met her up in London, but we're out in Buckinghamshire at the studio in the countryside. And Rupert would come down and basically prepare the tracks using keyboards, drum machines, and he also got the guitarist from the Fix, Jamie West Oram, to come in and play guitar parts and even get involved a bit in the sort of writing and arrangement. So we have the basic track recorded and mixed, and I think it's likely that Rupert might have put a little guide vocal on just so that he had a reference to the melody and everything while he was putting this together. Okay, so and I hadn't met Tina at this point, so then it was planned for her to come down and do her vocal. Now, this started to feel like probably quite a lot of pressure because, it's Tina for starters, massive star, I haven't met yet. And we know she's a great performer. And, I better be ready, And from what I learned, Rupert gave Tina a lift from London out to Farmyard Studios. It's about 45-minute drive. And from what I understand, he had a cassette of the track in the car. And so she was rehearsing it, sitting in the passenger seat of his car all the way. Apparently they had real looks. They had real looks when they stopped at traffic lights, and people could see, that's Tina Turner in there singing.
Wow.
But anyway, so she turned up at the studio, we were introduced, and it was almost like she was raring to go. And I'd spent the couple of hours leading up to this making sure I had a really good headphone mix, something that's very sort of hopefully creative and inspiring so that she would react to it. But also I had to sort of guess, what microphone am I going to use? But when I work with some singers, you lay out a collection of microphones, 4 or 5 microphones, to see which one works best with their voice. Tina, you better be ready to record right from the first moment. So I chose a microphone, a Neumann microphone. And then I thought, right, okay, I've got to be ready that I can get the levels and the sound and everything right really quickly, because it's going to be a lot of pressure. So I had, a chain of audio processing in line ready that I could adjust quickly and make choices. So I was terrified. Because I knew, it literally was, we don't have a run through to get sound checks or anything like that. It's like, you better press record, like from the first moment. So I'd met Tina and she was lovely and all the rest, but I was, as I say, a bit nervous. Anyway, so Rupert came in. She went out in the studio and he said, okay, you're going to hear the track. We'll give it a run through, he said to her. So, okay, so I pressed play and record and I was there standing over the knobs, ready to control things. And she started singing, and what I had expected was that she would probably go from a whisper to a shout in a moment. So how am I going to be ready for the kind of level and all of that? Anyway, without going into any boring details, I had various setups and things, and I was set